enabled. Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2.
Hello and welcome to The Thought League. Today we will discuss an important international situation, sanctions. In the face of geopolitical issues, the world has often used this powerful tool for arresting the situation. But it's not only sensitive, there is a very thin balance that needs to be maintained and has repercussions on almost all the countries, whether or not involved in the conflict situations. Let's understand sanctions in depth and how it impacts us here in India. And to deep dive into this, we have experts joining us on the Thought League. Let me welcome on the show Kaniecki, who's the partner at Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen and Hamilton, joining us from the US, and Cyril Shroff, managing partner at Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas. Gentlemen, so good to have you on CNBC TV18. Let's begin, Chase, by understanding the principles of sanctions, what it means, and when are the important situations when it can be used.
Sure. Hi, thank you for having me. Delighted to be here. So what we're seeing from a sanctions perspective is very targeted sanctions on Russia, and from an international perspective. We've seen the United States move in parallel with our European colleagues in the EU and the UK to impose very targeted sanctions on Russia, largely targeting the Russian financial sector, as well as territories in Ukraine that have been taken over by Russian forces, as well as blocking sanctions on a number of Russian entities and senior government officials in Russia, as well as debt and equity-related restrictions on certain Russian financial institutions and other companies. And so what companies are struggling with as an initial matter is understanding exactly what the sanctions landscape is. And in many ways, that can vary based on the jurisdiction that a company is operating within. US companies are subject to certain sanctions, whereas UK companies are subject to different sanctions. They're largely the same, but there are differences on the margins that it's important for companies to understand exactly what sanctions they're subject to and what the restrictions are. Some of the sanctions operate as prohibitions, meaning US companies, UK companies, EU companies are prohibited from engaging in certain types of transactions and activities in Russia or with certain Russian parties. But there's not a comprehensive embargo on Russia. And so in many ways, it's changing the ways that some companies do business in Russia. And even companies that aren't subject to these sanctions, for example, Indian companies aren't directly required to comply with US sanctions. We're seeing a number of issues in the sense of Indian companies voluntarily complying with the sanctions. And the reason for that is different for different companies. Yes. But the US primary sanctions that operate as prohibitions can apply to companies in India, for example, if they're processing transactions in US dollars. Sure. Those transactions are subject to the US sanctions requirements.
That's right. So Chase, there are so many aspects that you mentioned, and each one needs a little bit of deep dive. Let me also invite Cyril Shroff into that discussion. It's very clear from what Chase said that even though the sanctions are on the conflicting nations, but it's an interconnected world, Cyril Shroff, and every company, every country gets impacted. How has India responded to the sanctions so far?
The short answer is carefully. So we are, if I can talk on behalf of corporate India for a second, or the financial system. Sure. I think they are studying this very carefully. And there is the technical reality of the sanction, and then there is the perception of the sanction as well, including what can one expect around the corner. So the sanction scenario is an unfolding one. There are a bunch of entities or financial institutions that seem to have been initially covered. Those are clearly kind of off the table for transactions. But there is also the fear in many companies and businesses which do international transactions about what's next and what's around the corner. And if they get into a transaction and it kind of gets sanctioned, or the counterparty gets sanctioned, halfway through the process, then where does that leave them? So the broader reaction that we are seeing from our clients is, if it's anything to do with Russia, just kind of go slow or avoid it for now. Let's see how the situation kind of unfolds. So and there is also an issue of reputation. It's not just about the technical impact of the sanction, but at this point in the financial system, especially since many of Indian corporates deal with the US and UK banks, reputationally, there is a fear about how they would be perceived, whether they would be kicked off the consortium and things like that. So again, to answer a question in short, very carefully.
Right, very careful is a very carefully worded answer as well, Cyril Shroff, on this particular sensitive matter. But sanctions are expensive. Developed world probably can bear the burden, but not many countries, and therefore India's priority of protecting its own energy sources, because that is very critical to India at this point. How do you see a scenario where, the entire international community cannot take the burden? How do you assess this dichotomy?
Yeah, it's a difficult place for Indian companies to operate within, in the sense of, again, they're not prohibited from engaging in transactions with Russia or even in the Russian energy sector, as long as those transactions are undertaken outside the jurisdiction of these various sanctions regimes. And I think the carefully is exactly the right way to think about it for companies that are continuing to do business with Russia. And many of our clients are continuing to do business with Russia, understanding the landscape of the Russian sanctions regime. But there is a bit of uncertainty on what that regime is going to look like tomorrow or next week or next month. And so I think it is causing a lot of companies internationally to think carefully about and press pause perhaps on certain transactions. And I think that's largely impacting the international economy with respect to Russia, in the sense of folks waiting to do a business transaction with Russia. And I think that's going to continue as we see this conflict play out in the Ukraine. And I think in the long term, that is going to have a significant impact on the international economy and the way people do business with countries like Russia.
Right. So specifically in Indian companies context, Cyril Shroff, you were saying that there is a cautious approach and go slow approach. But what about certain situations where there are on-ground employees who are not Russian nationals, who are based in an Indian company which is based in Russia? How to handle situations like this, and how can companies at this point really protect themselves from several other issues which may come up later?
So it's probably a question that Chase better answer, but let me give you what I'm seeing on the ground. Is that Indians or Indian employees sitting in, say, a Russian subsidiary of an Indian entity, I don't see them as sanctioned just now. I think there must be a lot of fear about it, but technically the sanctions will not bite them as of now. So the way I understand the US sanction or the EU sanctions sitting in India is that certain entities or certain financial institutions or certain Russian persons have been sanctioned, and it's not every Russian or every Indian sitting in Russia or even every Indian entity over there, unless it does certain types of transactions.
Right.
So that may be part of the escalation mechanism going forward. So who knows what the future will hold. But at this point of time, the kind of example that you mentioned is safe.
Right. Chase, how do you look into this, and what are you advising to your various clients who have on-ground employees who are not Russian nationals but are working there?
Yeah, and it's an issue. It's really a practical issue that we're advising a number of clients on, particularly clients that have senior executives or board members that are US persons, UK persons, EU persons. What, if anything, do those people need to do and think about with respect to the business in Russia? Let's say the subsidiary is engaging in transactions with a sanctioned Russian financial institution or a sanctioned Russian entity. What does that mean for that US, UK, EU person? As a practical matter, it means that those people cannot be involved in approving or facilitating or really any involvement whatsoever in those types of dealings. And so it's really a matter of thinking about, what does the structure look like at a company? What are the nationalities of our various employees, either at our Russian subsidiary or at the parent company that's responsible for operating or running that Russian subsidiary? Do we have US, EU, UK nationals? And if so, what do we need to do to protect them from violating their country's laws, but allow our Russian business to continue to operate?
Right. So, Chase, you highlighted the various aspects, but I want to understand one more thing. Are there any laws, international laws, which protect the foreign nationals in conflicting countries? And also, are Indian companies looking at this to protect their business, the ones which are based in India, which are bought by the Russian company? And Cyril, Shroff, there have been some big companies which have been bought over by a Russian company in the past in India. So what happens in those situations? And are there any specific international laws that we are looking at for protection and for future lesser impact?
So if I were to take the example that you're kind of referring to, which is Indian incorporated entity with a significant Russian stake, what would be the impact on the Indian entity and its business? So I think the next question one needs to ask is whether that particular Russian entity is sanctioned or not. And if the answer is not, certainly there is some, there is a sense of fear around it. But legally, I don't think either the stake or the involvement in the Indian entity would be sanctioned or necessarily problematic. Now, that being said, as a practical matter, in the market, I think there is certainly a cloud. And for example, if the stake were to be sold or transferred or monetized in any manner, there would be a lot of hair around it. So whilst it's not specifically caught in the jaws of the sanctions, but given the general situation at this moment, I think there would be concerns about dealing with this kind of stake in any manner until the situation clears. And I think, as Chase said in the beginning, this is an evolving situation. We are just a month into the war. There is, it's unclear as to when the war will end and whether there is going to be more rounds of sanctions or not, and whether some of these entities themselves will be specifically caught in future versions of the sanctions. So I think it's back to let's wait and see.
Right. Chase,
let Chase comment on this.
Yes. Chase, what will you add to this evolving situation where there is so much uncertainty in the world right now?
Yeah, I think that the uncertainty is, of course, creating a lot of heartburn in the industry. And I think that uncertainty is here to stay until the conflict either gets resolved or we have a better understanding of what the sanctions landscape is going to be. And I wanted to mention, as I was listening to those remarks, that the U.S. sanctions are unique in the sense of there are the so-called primary sanctions that operate as a prohibition on the ability of U.S. persons to engage in certain transactions. But the U.S. government also has so-called secondary sanctions authority. And what that is it allows the U.S. government to impose sanctions on non-U.S. companies that engage in certain types of targeted activities, even if those activities are undertaken wholly outside of U.S. jurisdiction. And so I think the uncertainty of the current situation, plus the ability of the U.S. government and the threat of the U.S. government to impose secondary sanctions on parties that, for example, engage in transactions with sanctioned parties, I think really is causing a lot of companies, Indian and other non-U.S. companies, to really think hard about the extent of their operations in Russia. And again, sort of pulling back on, stepping into additional business right now.
That's right. But Chase, one quick question. It's the sanctions are not just unique, but they're also selective in nature.
That's right. The secondary sanctions are very discretionary, very political, in history, quite rarely imposed. But you can't tell clients that the risk is zero, that they'll be subject to secondary sanctions if they engage in transactions with sanctioned parties. There is risk there. The question is what type of discretion and what type of motivation is the U.S. government going to have to pursue companies that they don't have jurisdiction over for engaging in transactions with sanctioned parties? It's really a case-by-case analysis.
Case by case, and that puts, a lot more uncertainty to this subject, really. But Chase, Cyril, Shroff, we'll discuss more about what is the impact and the lasting impact, and how does the process of lifting sanctions work, and in the meantime, the collateral damage. Let's understand that after a very short break on the Thought League.
Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2. Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2.
Welcome back. You're watching The Thought League, and Chase and Cyril are discussing the world of sanctions, how it impacts our world, and the politics of the economics here involved here. Now, Chase, help us understand one particular aspect. There has been a collateral damage across the world. How do you see the sanctions continuing to also impact the world markets, the crude prices, and therefore the world economies?
Yeah, I think sanctions are here to stay for quite some time, in my view. The U.S. government, as well as our European colleagues or allies, have largely targeted the Russian financial sector and largely have left the Russian energy sector not sanctioned. But there have been some sanctions in the Russian energy sector, including prohibitions on importing Russian oil into the U.S., for example. But really, that's where, at least in my view, where sanctions likely are to go next if the situation continues to escalate in Ukraine. And so I think we'll see the U.S. and European allies target the Russian energy sector. And I think it'll be a very narrowly thoughtful, targeted exercise, given the reliance, particularly of our EU member country allies, on Russian oil. And so thinking about what those sanctions will look like. But I think that's the next, in our view, the next sanctions targeted industry in Russia. But I think even if the conflict resolves in the short term, I think the sanctions will be here to stay, in largely because they are political in nature, and particularly in the U.S., being tough on Russia right now is a political benefit for members of Congress and the like. And so I think we'll see sanctions here and here to stay, and folks unlikely to be willing to pull back on those sanctions in the short term.
Right, a very important point made there by Chase, that it will have a lasting impact and it will take longer to pull back the sanctions even after the conflict is over. Cyril, Shroff, would you agree that, this conflict and the sanctions and the international situation on especially crude oil prices and supply side constraints are the single largest reason for a lot of dampening of sentiment and hitting of bottom lines in the Indian businesses?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, ever since the finance minister presented the budget on 1st February, a lot has changed. And certainly the galloping energy prices is a big cause of, the current uncertainty, the energy inflation and the knock-on effects on, different parts of the economy and just the global uncertainty. This is the number one issue. I think, geopolitics was always very important, but it had kind of receded a little bit last year. I think the pandemic was the number one issue, but now geopolitics is front and center and on top of the agenda for every government, including ours, and every central bank, including ours. So this is going to have profound long-term implications, and not just on macroeconomics. I think on private contracts as well. I think in terms of access to international debt or equity markets, even long-term contracts, and I think the contracts, many new contracts will need to have to be sort of carefully configured on their force majeure or domination events. Even now, as we speak, I'm sure every major company which has a Russian counterparty will be looking very, very carefully at their contractual framework in terms of what happens, in terms of are these contracts suspended, is there an excuse for performance, if there are any losses, who's going to bear them. All that sort of stuff is going on now.
So, Cyril Shroff, very quickly, does this fall under the force majeure clause?
I think short answer is it depends on how it's drafted. Ordinarily, yes.
Right.
Because, I mean, it'll affect depending on whether the specific entity is a sanctioned entity or not. But if it is only, it's a sort of Russian system in general,
yes,
and there is just a level of difficulty in performing the contract, that would not be a force majeure.
That's a very important clarification coming in, and many companies would be looking at this particular aspect of the impact of the conflict as well as sanctions. But Chase, I want to understand one more aspect. Beyond sanctions, which has such a huge damaging impact on so many economies who probably cannot take the burden like the Western world can, are there other tools which are used in the politics of economics globally in such conflict situations? Have there been such lessons or learnings from the past?
There are other tools that the U.S. government has at its disposal to impose restrictions on countries that are engaging in activities that are contrary to U.S. foreign policy, and those include export controls. We saw that in the case of, for example, China in the last few years, where the U.S. government has ramped up export controls that are not necessarily sanctions. And so I think, in that export controls have been a part of the restrictions that have been imposed on Russia. And I think, thinking about, export controls, but also the types of sanctions that are being imposed on Russia are unique. No more are the days where the U.S. government imposes comprehensive sort of countrywide sanctions like Iran or North Korea. What the U.S. government is using now is these, what I view as smart sanctions, more narrowly tailored sanctions that aren't, for example, treating Russia as subject to a comprehensive embargo, but again, very narrowly targeting certain Russian financial institutions, certain Russian entities. But there are, as you correctly note, there are a number of tools that the U.S. government has at its disposal to impose restrictions on countries or actors that are engaging in activities that are contrary to U.S. foreign policy.
Right. So important points there, and this is an ever-changing environment in which the countries as well as companies will have to go along, deal with the situation and combat the issues as well as the impact. But as Chase and Cyril both mentioned, that it could have a lasting impact on economies of the world in terms of the sanctions that we are seeing in the current geopolitical situation. So we'll keep you updated on more developments on that. But this is an important aspect and an important boardroom conversation for various global companies, as well as most of the companies impacted due to crude oil prices as well as many supply chain constraints. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of the Thought League. Thank you so much, Chase, Cyril Shroff, for joining in with so many insights on this very important topic of sanctions. Thank you so much.
Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas presents CNBC TV18, The Thought League, Season 2.
Focus, ideate, innovate, enable.